Hi, good afternoon everyone. I'm Dave Munday, Lead Professional Officer with Unite Union in the health sector. I lead support to our members around mental health services and also lead on our group, the Mental Health Nurses Association. That's why we're here today. At our last committee meeting, I was talking to our lead committee reps at MHNA and I was explaining that we had a really good presentation about Brexit at the recent National Health Sector Committee. And they wanted to hear what the content was in that presentation. I thought rather than just trying to sort of like explain what I remember and understood, I would get the expert in the room and do that for them. But rather than call another meeting together, I thought it'd be really helpful if we did something online, but also to open that out wider to all our Mental Health Nurse Association members, because ultimately we know this is an area that our members are interested in. So I want to introduce you to Ben Norman, who is one of our researchers at Unite and is an absolute expert on this subject. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Ben, who's going to do the presentation. To be fair to Ben, normally he would do this in a room full of hundreds, sometimes maybe thousands of members. But today, obviously, it's in a room of just me. But Ben, good luck. And
Thank you, Dave, and no heckling, please. So, good afternoon, colleagues. It's a pleasure to speak with you today about what else but Brexit. And my thanks as well to Dave for organising this session. I think it's important to use these sort of tools to get this message out and to have this dialogue with as many members and reps as possible. So as Dave has mentioned, my name is Ben Norman. I'm part of the Unite research team based up in Holborn. And one of my duties is to help brief reps on the unfolding developments of the Brexit situation. Now, I've been doing this broadly since the referendum result back in 2016, and it's fair to say that there has been incremental glacial progress even up to that time, right up until the last few weeks, when suddenly events have picked up at an extreme pace and the situation is developing very rapidly indeed, day by day, sometimes hour by hour. But Dave is manning the Twitter account, so I'll be reliably informed if the government suddenly collapses or any other event which suddenly renders this all worthless. But for now, this all remains. So what I'm going to be talking with you through today is a bit of an update as to where the situation is, looking at the Brexit deal which has been proposed, Unite's take on that deal, what we'll be advising members and reps to do, and how we'll be campaigning on the issue, and then what we think is likely to happen in the days and weeks ahead, and then we'll be able to open up for discussion and questions. So without pausing any further, let's get straight into the issue. So as I've mentioned, I've been doing this talk many times, many hundreds of times, and now we can finally say that after months, after years in fact, and with only a handful of weeks to go really before that March 29 deadline when the UK will formally leave the European Union, we can now say it's a done deal, in as much at least as an actual deal has been published and put on the table for us to scrutinise. Up until that point, there's been vagueness, there's been prevarication. There was the fudged Chequers agreement, which was really an agreement between two sides of a warring Conservative Party, not really an agreement by any means between the UK and the European Union. And now we've moved on to a formal agreement between the EU and the UK government, which was ratified by the EU on the 25th of November, and will shortly be going to Parliament on December the 11th for the meaningful vote. But just to say done deal, of course, isn't sufficient, because, well, really, what does that deal look like? What does it mean for our members? How have we analysed it? What is our recommendations on that? What will be campaigning on it? And to open a far broader question, is it even accurate to say a deal has been done at all? Is it really a deal? So let's get a little bit into the detail of that. What actually has been agreed and what actually will be proposed? So that really comes in two key parts. The first part is the withdrawal agreement. That is the whole 380 page plus document, which you can see here with Donald Tusk and Michel Barnier. That is the document which was ratified at the EU summit on the 25th. That will be, if it's supported by MPs on the 11th, that would be a legally binding document in the UK and international law. So that is the substance, really. But crucially, as I'll explain in a moment, that only deals, as the name suggests, with the withdrawal of the UK from the EU. That is, if you like, the divorce proceedings. That does not constitute a whole deal, because obviously it comes in two parts. There's how we leave the EU, and then fundamental importance is then what happens after that. What is the future relationship between the EU and the UK? And does the government have a mandate to pursue the vision that it has? And will it even admit what that vision is? Well, that part is covered in the second area, which is the political declaration. Now, this is a far shorter, far vaguer document, about 26 pages, exactly 26 pages in fact, and it's very vague, and importantly, it is non-legally binding. It was ratified at the EU on the 25th. It will be part of the package, if you like, which will be put and debated by MPs. But if you like, as I'll explain in a moment, this is to cover up the fact that there has been no agreement, that there is no deal about the future trading relationship. Instead, it's a framework agreement for what those talks will look like to reach a deal after we've left the EU. So really, it's a set of aspirations, it's a set of agreed red lines, those red lines which haven't really shifted in the last 2 years. And the best way I think of explaining this, and when we're discussing it with reps and members, this is the equivalent of if our reps were to table a pay claim with the employer. It's not the final end product of a negotiation which would be put out to members. It is in fact just a series of aspirations for basis for a future discussion. And we would say, as I'll explain, that even taken together amounts to maybe half a deal at best. It is not sufficient to meet any of the red lines that Unite has been campaigning on for the past 2 years. So I think in order to fully understand why that is, I think it's important to look back, to take a step back and look at the whole Brexit process. And really, how was this supposed to go? Why is it that the negotiations have moved from being able to publish a whole deal in its entirety, which we could analyse and look at, and then we'd get support and we would leave the EU? Why did we not achieve that? Why instead do we have this half deal, only the divorce proceedings, and then this weak, very vague political declaration? Or to phrase it another way, how has it come to this? Well, this is the timeline to Brexit. This has served me well, this slide, for the past year and a half. And it really shows you how the negotiations were supposed to plan out. And really, this is, if you like, the smoothest possible flight path to Brexit. This is what the government and the EU had set out to achieve all the way back in March 2017. And we can look at this, look at the stages along the way, and look at where these negotiations failed and how we've ended up where we are. So, if you take this in its entirety, this shows you the entire process of withdrawal from the day Article 50 was triggered. That's that clause in the EU Constitution which begins a 2-year countdown for a member state, the UK, to leave the EU. Never been triggered before, so a lot of unknowns about that. But that was triggered back in March 2017. That then began the 2-year countdown to take us to March 29th, 11 o'clock on 2019, which is now set in law as the UK's Brexit Day. And what was supposed to happen then is 2 broad stages within that 2-year period. There were supposed to be the negotiations themselves, and then once those negotiations had concluded and a deal had been reached, then it would go for ratification. So it would go to the European Parliament, it would go to the EU Summit, the EU leaders, it would go to the House of Commons for a meaningful vote. And were that then to happen, that would take us to March 2019 with a deal, and we would have then left. It didn't work out quite as simple as that. And the reason is this: the negotiations themselves were split into 2 main areas. That is the divorce proceedings, the withdrawal agreement as it now is, and then the future trading relationship. Now, the first half of that, the divorce proceedings, they had to cover 4 key areas in order for us to leave the EU with any sort of stability or agreement in place. They had to cover these 3 issues here, which is the so-called divorce bill, that is the UK's financial contribution to the EU, estimated to be around £39 billion. Then secondly, they had to cover citizens' rights, what we often call the right to remain, for the 3.8 million EU citizens living in the UK, and their dependents, of course, and also the 1 million plus UK residents residing in the European Union as well. Had to be agreement on that. Then there had to be agreement on what became the intractable issue of Northern Ireland, and we'll touch on that in a moment. Once those 3 areas have been agreed, that would be the basis only for withdrawal, and that would unlock, if you like, what is called the transitional period, which would be a period whereby any trade deal which had been negotiated would be implemented. Now, in theory, had these 3 areas been agreed, and had there been political approval for a transitional period, a sort of period of stability, that would have then unlocked the second part of the talks, which was supposed to begin in March, which is the future trading relationship. What is the future trade deal? Do we have a whole new deal, never seen before? Do we have the Norwegian option, the Swiss option, the Canadian options, all these off-the-shelf trade deals? The idea then was that you agree these 3 areas and you unlock the withdrawal agreement, You enter the trade talks, you decide what your political vision is as a government, what it is you want to achieve, what you want that future relationship to be. You agree that. Those things go together. They go to the EU summit, which was supposed to be in October. That gets approved. It then goes to the national parliament. It goes to the European Parliament. That takes us out of the EU with a full deal, as was supposed to happen, and then the transitional period begins. And I think the important tell here is what the government refers to when we say a transitional period and why that's important. The UK government always calls it a transitional period. The EU always calls it an implementation period. Now the reason that's important is this. The point is, when you have a full deal, a full package, withdrawal and future trade deal, it takes a long time for that to be implemented, for that to be put into effect. So the idea was that between March 2019 and December 2020, we would have a broadly 21-month period by which everything would remain the same, and the trade deal that had been negotiated prior to Brexit would then be implemented in that period. Then when December 2020 came along, we would be formally out, and that trade deal would have taken effect, and that new trading relationship, that new relationship between the EU and the UK would begin properly. The problem, of course, is that it didn't go as smoothly as that. What really happened is that there was an agreement to have a transitional period, or an implementation period as the EU would call it, and there was agreement on the divorce bill. So the UK government effectively capitulated to that. There was agreement about citizens' rights, insofar as the UK government has committed itself to the Settled Status Programme. We can discuss that a bit later. You know, it has some criticisms of that, but nevertheless, that was agreed. Then we got to the intractable issue of Northern Ireland. Now, the reason that issue is intractable is this. In the various speeches the Prime Minister has given, the Lancaster speech, the Mansion House speech, she's always committed the Conservative Party to a series of red lines. The two most important of which, from their point of view, have always been the UK will leave the single market and it will leave the customs union, which is, if you like, the external tariff barrier of the European single market. If we do both of those things, that therefore means that there has to be an economic border between the UK and the European Union. If that is the case, then the only place that exists as a land border currently is between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Now the problem has always been this: if you have an economic border, that would require some form of customs checks, it may require regulatory differences, certainly if the UK were to go down this race to the bottom divergence route. If you start having customs checks, then you need infrastructure. If you have infrastructure, you may well need to protect that infrastructure, and very quickly an economic border, which could be invisible, or a regulatory border, suddenly becomes a hard border, and suddenly you have an issue whereby the Good Friday Agreement of 97-98 is undermined, and the integrity of the island of Ireland is suddenly a problem. So the question has always been, if the UK is going to leave those economic spheres of the EU, where do you draw the border, and how do you prevent undermining the Good Friday Agreement? Now there's been a couple of different suggestions about that from the Conservative side, and indeed all sides, but the Conservatives have never been able to square that circle, wanting to leave but not wanting to have a border. So what they had agreed, and I'll go on to the other things they discussed, but what they had agreed in December, when we reached the end of these period of the talks, was this idea of the backstop. Now the backstop, which is really central to the debate as it currently stands, was this idea that if all of this were to collapse as a sort of last-ditch resort, Northern Ireland alone would basically have ended up remaining in the single market and the customs union in order to maintain the integrity of the island of Ireland. Now the UK government had basically signed up to that, but no sooner had the ink dried on that discussion than Theresa May receives a phone call from Arlene Foster, the leader of the DUP, a coalition partner in Northern Ireland, and they are very clear that that backstop arrangement is a fundamental red line for them, because it would mean the economic separation and divergence of Northern Ireland to the rest of the UK. So effectively what happened then is the UK pulled the plug on that backstop idea, and the talks basically stalled in December, which meant that that was never resolved. It still isn't resolved really, and then the trade talks scheduled for March never really began. The UK government never really put on the table what it wanted to achieve from those trade talks. They never began, they never got into any substance, which meant that when the EU summit came along in October, when that deal was supposed to be signed off, it didn't happen. The government didn't propose anything. So instead what they did, of course, they did agree these two areas. They have tried to fudge the third one, and they did agree a transitional period, a 21-month period of grace. But the problem is, of course, if you don't have a trade deal, then you've got nothing to implement in the so-called implementation period. So all you achieve by having this in a deal is a 21-month period of grace where the potential cliff edge, hard Brexit, line simply moves over here for 21 months. It doesn't fundamentally achieve or advance anything. So what they've fundamentally done then, taking this as a whole, is they've looked at the negotiations, they've seen how they've failed to address the issue of Northern Ireland, and they've basically cut the negotiations in half, and they're only presenting half a deal to Parliament on December the 11th. They're talking about the divorce proceedings that they did try and agree, a fudge position on Northern Ireland, which has become very contentious indeed, and nothing on the trade talks. That's why you have this vague political declaration to try and cover the fact that those trade talks never happened. And the idea is, from the Tories' point of view, that we leave in March 2019, and then these trade talks scheduled for March this year really begin in March next year, i.e. we negotiate our trade deal with the EU once we've left and we've got the minimum amount of leverage to achieve what we'd want to do. So that's where the talks were, that's where the talks fell down, and that's why we're being proposed really half a deal at best, if it's even legitimate to call it a deal at this stage. Now, I've mentioned Northern Ireland already, but just to sort of touch on this again, if Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK is to leave the economic spheres of the EU, you have to draw an economic border, and the question is, where does it go? It can only go in two places. It can only go north to south, undermining the Good Friday Agreement, or it could potentially go east to west across the Irish Sea, threatening regulatory and potentially economic separation of Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. Now, this is really an intractable problem of the Tories' own making. They've only made it this issue because they've always said we have to leave a single market, we have to leave a customs union, therefore there has to be an economic border. We want the right to deregulate, we want the right to reduce workers' rights, we want the right to sign trade deals with countries which would precipitate that race to the bottom. Therefore, they've created this issue. Now, what they ended up doing to try and fudge it in the deal is basically to say, well, okay, if the DUP will not accept a Northern Ireland only backstop, because that would be economic separation, therefore what they'll propose is a UK-wide backstop. So in the withdrawal agreement, if everything were to collapse, if there was no agreement on a future trade deal, then as an emergency temporary measure, you would basically have all of the UK remaining in the customs union in some form. Now that is obviously red rag to a bull for the Brexiteers, because they don't want to have any relationship with the customs union the UK can't walk away from unilaterally, because that would mean they can't sign these independent race to the bottom trade deals. But miraculously, whilst Theresa May had the option of upsetting the Brexiteers or the DUP, she's managed to upset both constituents, insofar as the Brexiteers aren't happy at the prospect of the UK being trapped in a temporary, narrow version of the customs union. But they also say that because the UK wants the right to deregulate and to have this race to the bottom, Northern Ireland, as part of this backstop agreement, will maintain a deeper regulatory alignment with the rest of the EU. So she managed to go for the worst of both worlds from her backbench perspective. They have an element of the customs union they don't want, and the DUP say that Northern Ireland will be economically separated potentially from the rest of the UK. A red line for them. Now, how do you solve an intractable problem like Northern Ireland? It is simple. From Unite's point of view, and indeed from the Labour Party's point of view, there is no reason for the UK to leave the customs union. We have been saying we want a permanent, comprehensive customs union between the UK and the EU to maintain integral supply chains, to maintain imports and exports. That can be everything from the automotive sector to pharmaceutical products, etc., etc. If you remain in the customs union, you do not need to have an economic border north to south or east to west. It's purely a political problem of the Tories' own creating, and that is a fundamental red line. But it's important not to be fooled, as the Tories will try and claim, but this backstop idea somehow does keep us in the customs union and therefore maintains what we've been demanding. Because there is a world of difference between a comprehensive permanent customs union that achieves the industrial demands we have across all sectors and a temporary measure that the government never intend to use, even if they have succeeded in angering both sides of their own party on this issue. So it is a highly complex scenario, and the reason it's highly complex is because the Conservative government has basically fudged the issue, and they continue to try and do so, which is a reason why, from Unite's point of view, with members in both the North and the South, we'll be arguing that the deal on this basis does not provide any long-term guarantees of avoiding a potentially disastrous economic separation or potential hard borders, be that down the land or be that across the sea. So that's the issue of Northern Ireland there. So the question is, it comes to this. They're going to propose a deal. We've already covered the fact that it's only really half a deal. We've covered the fact that they have this political declaration which is vague and non-binding. All this will be going before MPs and it will contain these fudge positions on Northern Ireland, etc., etc. The question then is, now it's out, how has Unite judged it? And when it goes to the House of Commons, how will the Labour Party be judging it and what will Unite be advising? What are we currently advising? Well, this is the all-important 6 tests. Now, these 6 tests were initially published by Keir Starmer, the Shadow Secretary for Brexit for the Labour Party. They've been endorsed by Unite. And indeed, at our recent policy conference back in the summer, we took these and we've developed them far further, looking at key industrial demands that we have, what a deal has to achieve in order to, at the very minimum, mitigate the economic fallout of Brexit for our members, and also make sure that enhancing workers' rights, there's no barrier to that, and there's no barrier for the radical economic programme of a potential Corbyn-led government, which is, of course, remains the prize. So, these are the 6 tests, however, which the Labour Party will be using to judge the deal when it comes before the House of Commons on the 11th. Now, there's a couple of key ones for us. Firstly, of course, does it maintain the exact same benefits as we currently have as members of the single market and the customs union? Now, the reason they've used the phrase exact same benefits is because that is throwing back a quote which David Davis, the 2 previous ago Brexit secretaries, promised the House, that there would be no economic fallout to mitigate, but we would have the exact same benefits, everything would continue as before. Imports and exports would continue, regulatory alignment would continue, supply chains, both for the NHS and for manufacturing, would continue. Working people would not be forced to pay the price for Brexit. That's what we were promised, and that's what's been quoted back to them. We know for a fact the deal will not achieve that. And for us, for our own concerns, of course, does a deal prevent a race to the bottom in terms of working rights, or does it in fact defend working rights and give us the scope for enhancing working rights? Can we peg them to EU levels? So if EU working rights rise, so they will in the UK, or do they allow us to go far further than the EU in many instances? That's a key test for us and a key demand for us. The full list of demands which Unite has published, which includes things such as membership of key regulatory bodies for pharmaceutical and nuclear, all the way to our position on the customs union, the single market, working rights, etc., etc. All of those are covered in an EC statement which went before policy conference back in the summer, and that's available on the Unite Brexit Check website. And I would urge you to look at that so you can look at the key red lines Unite has been putting forward. So the question then is, we have these tests. Does the deal meet it? Well, fundamentally, no. No spoilers, but no. This is how we're describing it. Now, this is the cover of a prototype leaflet that we've been putting together for workplaces and for reps to try and explain why Unite is opposed to the deal as it currently stands. And our starting point should be, of course, that it doesn't matter how you voted, if you voted Remain, if you voted Leave, this does not satisfy anybody. It does, certainly for members who voted to leave the EU, this does not deliver the sort of Brexit they were promised, and it does not deliver any form of security or long-term commitments to our members in Northern Ireland or Gibraltar or to manufacturing sectors or the NHS. There's scarcely a sector of Unite which would not be negatively impacted by this deal going through. That's a fundamental crux of it. And we're calling it, of course, the blindfold Brexit. Why? Because all the deal achieves is rushing us out the door. It agrees with divorce proceedings. It gets us to March 29th. We're then out of the EU when we then have to negotiate what we actually want as a deal when we're already out. It is asking us to take an absolute leap of faith, put all of our confidence and hopes in the government, in the idea that once we've left, then they will decide to negotiate a better trade deal. And most likely, then Theresa May's successor will be asked to do it. So she is basically abdicating responsibility, washing her hands of it. This is bare bones agreement just to get us out of the EU with no long-term security, no way of mitigating the potential damage of that. Donning the blindfold and just taking a leap of faith. That is utterly unacceptable for Unite and indeed the wider trade union movement. So on that basis alone, we would be opposing it. Why specifically then, if we get into some of the areas? Well, if you take the divorce proceedings, as I've mentioned, highly limited, only covers half a deal at best. And as I mentioned before, being inside the customs union, having a proper customs union is a red line for us. And even Theresa May has said in her own backstop, it isn't the same. They never intend to use it. It doesn't deliver any form of job security for our members. So on that basis, we also would reject it. Again, with a political framework, it's non-binding. So even the very weak ambitions which are in that political framework, which do not meet our tests, even those are worthless, because there is an acknowledgement that the moment that those trade deal negotiations begin in March on the Tories plan, that document will be parked. It will be scrapped. It's only the framework for the beginning of the talks. It's not worth the paper it's printed on. It is used simply to mask the fact there is no comprehensive deal. Taken together, then, we will be rejecting this deal. What specifically is included in the political declaration? So that's where they talk about what are their ambitions for the future trade deal. Worthless ambitions, non-legally binding ambitions, but ambitions nonetheless, and that's all we've got to judge it on. Well, in these non-binding aspirations, firstly, they row back on the idea that they even want to achieve frictionless trade. That's been a key demand of many of our sectors, be that for the 1,100 trucks from the automotive sector that cross the border every single day, or be that the, again, time-critical supply chains for the NHS, for pharmacy, or indeed for the food sector. Frictionless trade has gone from a promise to an ambition to not even be mentioned in this. There is an acceptance in this. There will be new border checks, there will be more delays, and that will have an economic impact, which some employers will want to pass down onto our members, of course. That's obviously the dynamic between labour and capital here. Secondly, then, there's no protection for working rights. That's a fundamental red line. They don't even say in this that they want to model some of the weaker trade deals that have been done, where they talk about ILO conventions, which again aren't even enforceable, or things of those nature. There is nothing in the political declaration which would commit any government to maintaining working rights to their current standard, let alone allowing us to go far further than that, for example, taking on the disastrous anti-trade union laws which are currently in impact, which is a key battle and a key demand for our movement, of course. So there's no scope of that within that agreement and no protections for what we do have left. That's important. Thirdly, another area where the government has reneged on its promises is regulatory bodies. Now, each sector has one. There's about 80 in total, so each sector has many. In the Mansion House speech, Theresa May mentioned a couple. She said, for example, that for the aerospace sector and for the civil aviation sector, we would remain membership or associate membership of EASA. That's the European Aviation Safety Agency. For the NHS and for the nuclear industry, we would remain in Euratom, which regulates civil nuclear, including not only power plants, but also radiation treatments, etc., etc. Then there's also the pharmaceutical regulations. And as I say, each sector has 2 or 3 of these regulatory bodies that we have always said we want at least associate membership from. The government promised that. Theresa May promised it in Mansion House speech. In this, she's rowed back from that promise. She has said that while we will seek close cooperation with those bodies, there is no commitment to even associate membership status. That could have an immediate chilling impact for some of our sectors. For example, that would mean that cabin crews in the aviation sector won't be able to get licenses to operate in Europe. It would mean that aerospace components made in the UK couldn't be fitted into European aircraft. Or at best, in the case of pharmaceutical regulations, for example, it would mean falling out of key centralised databases, such as the databases for drug side effects, such as the databases for counterfeit drugs. We'd be falling out of those, and the NHS would have to replicate those regulations and those databases and those other safety standards at huge cost, and only in 21 months' time, which isn't really achievable, especially when the NHS is buckling under the pounding it's been given by the government's continued austerity offensive. So that is no small thing. That sounds highly technical, but that could be existential crises for many of our industrial sectors, and that will have an impact on jobs if we do not ultimately have associate membership of those bodies. Then, of course, is the issue of Northern Ireland I've already addressed, whereby basically the deal suggests and infers it gives the Tories scope for a race to the bottom, so i.e. an attack on working rights. That would mean a divergence of the UK from the EU standards, but the backstop means Northern Ireland would maintain a form of alignment with the EU, which would mean a sea border becomes inevitable between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. So that is again a fundamental red line for our members across the island of Ireland. So no matter which way you cut it, no matter which way you look at that political declaration and that deal, It is not sufficient for our red lines, it is not sufficient for our movement, and we will be calling for MPs to reject it, and we will be campaigning on that basis. There is a key thing here which is a bit of an issue as well, in terms of some employers, some large employers, particularly multinationals, and some of the trade federations, for example, have put their support behind it, unwillingly, and in the case of a CBI, quite dishonestly, if we're being utterly honest about it ourselves. Now, the reason for that is what the government are trying to do is two things. They're trying to say to employers, you will be given through this deal that 21-month transitional period. They don't want to call it an implementation period because they've got nothing to implement. But they call it the transitional period. You will be given a 21-month period of grace where everything will remain the same, so you don't need to worry about the cliff edge for 21 months, and you'll be given a seat at the table to help negotiate the final trade deal. That's for the employers, that's not for the trade unions, that's not for members. Now, from our point of view, it doesn't matter if you're looking at any sector. If you take manufacturing, for example, you take civil aviation, etc., 21 months does not offer any industry stability. All it offers is time to relocate and to mitigate the impact and to pass the cost of Brexit down onto working people. So there is a point of divergence between many large employers and groups like the CBI and ourselves and the trade union movement, but let's be honest, it was ever thus, and that point of divergence was always going to come, because we are campaigning for a Brexit deal in our members' interests, and that's always going to be the fundamental red line for us. Just as a bit of context, I won't dwell too long on this slide, but this was initially leaked, in fact, by the European Commission. It's now available online. It's worth looking at. What it shows is all the different types of trade deals which were on offer to the UK right at the beginning of this process, and why the UK government has ruled them all out at every single stage, and what it leaves us with. So you start at the top of the ladder, you've got full EU membership, all the benefits of that, etc. And then you go down to what the Norwegians have, the Swiss, the Ukrainians, the Turks, and then you fall out of any permanent or associate membership of the EU down onto the sorts of trade deals that South Korea and the Canadians have. And that's the last-ditch saloon options, if you like, before you end up with a no-deal scenario with no formal relationship with the EU whatsoever, and you're operating on WTO, World Trade Organization rules. So the question is, if you took all this is the what you could have won slide, where does the deal place us? Well, basically it places us right at the bottom here where that blue arrow is. And all that you're seeing in the fights between the Conservative Party particularly is to say Theresa May has a vision to place us here, Jacob Rees-Mogg, even though he doesn't have the political clout he claimed he once did, is trying to place us here. Both of these things are the weakest, least sufficient types of trade deals we could try and arrange, and they are, again, that last chance saloon before you fall into the economic calamity, really, of what would be a no-deal scenario. So I think it's just useful for context that these groups are basically debating right around the peripheries here, when all these different options were open to us. And that's just a handful of them. It's worth noting that every country that borders the EU has its own economic, unique relationship with the EU. It was entirely possible, had the government's red lines been different, had they not bogged themselves down with their ideology and their rhetoric, that we could have come up with a bespoke UK deal which had met many of our red lines, for example. But they didn't. Obviously, they were never going to. That's their politics. But it's useful to know that they rejected all of these things because it shows you how many other options that there were. So that's the deal. The question, of course, and this is the key thing, is is it going to be implemented? Is it actually going to get through the House of Commons? Well, this is really a very fast-moving political situation, so anywhere there's a number, do take that with a pinch of salt because that is changing. But the key thing to show you here is that Theresa May has pretty much zero support, politically speaking, for this deal. So, don't forget, Theresa May only has a majority of 13 if you include the DUP. The DUP are in opposition, effectively on strike action, so she's reduced to a majority of 3, and what she needs is 320 votes on December the 11th to get this thing through the House of Commons. So who's lined up to oppose that then? Well, there's the Conservative Party itself. In this case, these are the group which was rallied around Dominic Grieve, Nicky Morgan, Anna Soombury. These are people in the Conservative Party who've pushed for a softer Brexit. They are people who've campaigned for Remain, for example. They were always hostile to any form of deal Theresa May would come up with. Initially, she looked like she may well try and pursue a softer Brexit to win back political support. She's failed that. There's a constituency there who will not be voting for it. Then, of course, you've got the DUP. Well, for the reasons I've outlined, the DUP won't be supporting it. So that's her majority gone. And they're not a party for turning, so it does look like we will go all the way in refusing to back it. Then you've got, of course, Jacob Rees-Mogg and his ERG Hard Brexiteer group. Now, they didn't have the 45 letters or indeed the bottle to be able to sink Theresa May a couple of weeks ago. They turned out to be something of a political paper tiger after all this time. But they do have enough MPs in their pocket to make sure she doesn't get the majority needed to support the deal, most likely. And that, by the way, is only her own side. Those are the people she's managed to fail to win support from in her own party and coalition. A remarkable achievement, if there ever was one. Then, of course, you've got business, the lobbying front. They have formally come out in favour of the deal to try and help sway some MPs on the right side, but the wrong side of history. And the CBI, in leaked emails, have said, actually, don't congratulate it too much. It's not a good deal. We're just having to put our name to it in order to try and curry favour with the government. So even the big business lobbying doesn't genuinely support it. But back in the House of Commons, well, the Labour Party's got a very firm position about opposing the deal, does not meet the 6 tests, and Jeremy Corbyn has said very clearly, as has Keir Starmer, has to have all wings of the Labour Party, in all honesty, that they will be seeking to vote this deal down. So that's fundamentally important. Then, of course, you've got the smaller parties, the devolved parties, Plaid Cymru, the SNP, etc., the Green Party. They are all implacably opposed to that deal as well. And then just to add to it, then of course you've still got some sections of the EU which are opposed to the deal. So obviously there was an issue with the Spanish government over the issue of Gibraltar, which required more concessions from the government as well. So fundamentally, Theresa May, it's not looking good for Theresa May in terms of can she win any support from it. Now this figure is probably a little bit dated, it's only a few hours old, but it would appear she needs that number. It would appear there's at least 408 MPs against the deal, maybe 231 who support it. But that number is changing all the time. We're seeing the government handing out peerages, we're seeing them trying to, Theresa May is going on her speaking tour, trying to do TV debates with Corbyn, all about trying to convince local Conservative associations to put pressure on their MPs to support the deal. So it may well be that this number grows over that lobbying effect, but as it stands, there isn't any hope of this deal going through in the first instance. Now, we shouldn't be complacent about that. This is a very changing situation, and we need to ensure that we are being strong with our own MPs and any MPs where in your own constituencies to make sure that they are voting against this deal. But it would look, on this basis, that the deal will fall on December the 11th when it goes to the House of Commons, on the first round. The question then is, well, what happens next? What happens if they do vote down the deal on December the 11th? Well, to put this into context, what's Unite's position on that, and then what may well happen? Well, again, I refer you to the EC statement, which was passed at our policy conference back in the summer. It commits us to a few things. It was overwhelmingly passed after a very lengthy debate of some hours on conference floor. It proposed a clear series of red lines, which I've already elaborated on, for judging any deal. We utterly reject the idea of no deal. That is an utterly unacceptable outcome for us, and we will campaign against that as well. And we say this sentence, this couple of paragraphs about what should happen in the event that that deal is rejected. Well, firstly, we say when we know what the deal is and what our tests are, we will mobilise politically and industrially against the deal. That's where we currently are. Now, if that deal is voted down, Unite's position is that would be sufficient for a vote of no confidence in the government, and we believe that would be sufficient to trigger a general election. That is our primary demand in this scenario. It would change, of course, the whole political landscape. It would potentially unlock a very different sort of Brexit deal, and it would fundamentally remove those political red lines and blockages that the Conservative Party have been putting in place for the past 2 years due to their own divisions. A general election, of course, is a game-changing event, and that would be our priority to try and achieve that. However, of course, if that isn't possible, due to maybe the Fixed Term Parliament Act, maybe the parliamentary numbers change, if there's some parliamentary block on that, but the deal has been rejected, we will keep open the possibility of a popular vote, a people's vote on the terms of departure, on the terms of the deal. And the important point here is that this conference motion mandates our executive, our sovereign democratic body within our trade union, to make that decision and to respond to political events as they unfold. So to put that more clearly, I suppose, it is not for any one individual within the trade union, even for the General Secretary himself, to simply proclaim what we will be doing. It is for the democratic decision-making bodies within our union to make that decision. And our executive is, of course, meeting just this week. So, of course, this will be tabled, this will be debated, all of the options are there. But the key thing is, as seasoned negotiators, we know not to take any option off the table. But any option we do pursue will have a democratic mandate from the membership to pursue. That's fundamental importance. But the key line here is no option remains off the table. And that is important. So that's the general context of our position to going forward. Well, the question then is, what do we think is likely to happen? Well, this is, if you like, a diagram of what's in play. So we've passed these initial stages. We've seen what the deal is. That got bounced through Cabinet. That deal went to the EU on November the 25th. That got ratified there. It's then coming to the House of Commons in December. Now, let's say Theresa May pulls off a political miracle and she secures enough votes to get it through. Then it becomes binding law. It's already an international treaty. It gets passed. It goes to the European Parliament. There's a vote there. Then the UK leaves the EU on March. That transitional period begins. We have a 21-month period of grace. Then the trade talks proper begin. And really, that means we start all of this all over again. And undoubtedly, I would be speaking to you again many times before we get to the December 2020. That doesn't look likely to happen, in all honesty. The question then is, what happens in the event of a no vote? Well, formally, the government would have 21 days to come back to Parliament, potentially repeatedly, with an improved deal, or indeed put the same deal in. Now, the government have they've been determined to prevent this debate going into the new year. We know parliamentary recess is on the 18th, and so we know the government will want to try and close down that political time frame as much as possible. What Theresa May can do, it really depends on the extent of her defeat. If it's an overwhelming defeat, it'll be very difficult for her to survive and for her to remain as Prime Minister. Those famous Tory men in grey suits may well come knocking on her door, as they did for Thatcher. But legally, she can come back to the House of Commons the next day and the next day with even the same deal, because it's very unlikely she's going to get any concessions from the EU to improve it, certainly in the way that the right-wing Brexiteers would want her to. So it will come back to the House. The question then is, if all those MPs vote the right way and vote it down on December 11th, will they continue to vote that way on the second vote, the third vote? There's some speculation about, there'll be whole loads of whipping operations going on, of course, and there's speculation about what will happen to the financial markets, all those things that could spook weak and wobbly MPs. So it's all to play for there. There is no room for complacency whatsoever. I cannot stand here and promise you that vote will not go through. All I can promise you is it's exceedingly unlikely at this point. But the key thing here is, the government's propaganda is you have two choices, May's deal or no deal, because no deal is the default option. That is not the case. If the MPs vote this deal down, it opens up several options. It gives us far more options than we currently have. Excuse me. So, we could choose to leave with no deal. Obviously, that's for Jacob Rees-Mogg, ERG Group fantasy. We could seek to renegotiate. The EU have said, if there's enough political developments in the UK, i.e. a general election or another sort of people's vote, that changes the political landscape, i.e. if there's actually something for us to discuss, only then would they be up for renegotiating it, or at least parts of it. There's talk about a potential 9-month extension to the Article 50 process in order to achieve that. So that is still on the table. Then, of course, is the question of a general election or a form of referendum, be that a referendum on a reenactment of 2016, or indeed a vote on terms of departure, in terms of the deal themselves. All of those things remain in play. Now, we have seen a series of amendments be tabled, and this is where we really go into that political black hole of Westminster procedure. We have seen a whole load of amendments be tabled to this bill, which include, and this is a fundamental one for us, rejecting in principle the outcome of no deal. So that will give, this is going to be a key argument for us, and that's beginning to form around Westminster for sure, is how can we ensure MPs prevent no deal from happening if they reject May's deal? Well, it would appear that they could put down an amendment, they could have a parliamentary majority of, say, 500 MPs against no deal, and then that would be a sufficient mandate to force the government effectively into requesting an extension of the negotiating period in order to go back and negotiate something different. That could prevent a no deal. What I'm saying, it is entirely possible, entirely realistic, and there is a parliamentary majority both for sinking May's deal and preventing no deal, and keeping all of these options on the table. So that is of fundamental importance. We cannot be blackmailed and bounced into believing that we have to support May's deal as some sort of damage limitation exercise. That is not the case. I can stand here and tell you definitively that that deal will not save a single job in any of our industrial sectors any more than no deal. So for us, doesn't meet our red lines, offers us nothing, and we'll be campaigning adamantly to sink this thing. This is really a return to that final slide, which really makes the same broad points. Of course, we're into December now. Then we look to getting into January, February. All sorts of things come into play there. If it is rejected, again, all options remain on the table for that. And then we shall see how that maintains and develops. So the question is then, what happens in the coming days and weeks? Well, Unite has committed itself to lobbying against the deal and committed ourselves to preparing, of course, industrially for whatever may happen. So in the coming days, and indeed the coming hours, I suspect, a whole new series of tools and resources will be put on our websites and put online on social media for you to use and share. That will include a lobbying tool, Unite for a Better Deal. This isn't live just yet, but will be in the coming hours. That will be a tool for you to lobby your MPs in order to say this deal does not meet our tests and I'm calling for you to vote this down. There'll be a whole series of memes and videos designed to explain to your members and to your other workplace colleagues why this deal is unacceptable for us. There's the Blindfold Brexit leaflet, which is available. Again, all of this is available on the Unite Brexit Check website, unitebrexitcheck.org. All of these resources, all of these social tools, and all of the other briefing documents about why we're against the deal and what the deal means for individual sectors, and what we're seeing so far unfold. So the idea there is that we apply maximum industrial and political pressure on MPs to get this deal sunk, keep all options open to ourselves so we can continue to pursue and fight for Brexit or any other outcome which is in our members' interests. So I always say the same thing here, that this talk inevitably opens up far more questions than answers. Dave may well have some already, so I'm happy to have that discussion with you all. If not, I've already said I work for the research department in Holborn. You're more than welcome to get in touch with me, either directly or via your own sector researcher, and I can provide briefings of the material about this for your own members. So thank you very much, and I'd like to see if there's any questions. Thank you, colleagues.
Right, Ben, that was brilliant, thank you. We have had a couple of questions in. So the first one is a question from one of our reps who works in the health service. Have you got any tips on what they should be doing to prepare for what comes next?
So absolutely. So this is a fundamental question, really. So a lot of this talk has dealt with the political events unfolding. But for us, of course, Brexit, I mean, it is a political event, undoubtedly. Political forces drive it. But for most of our members, it will be experienced in the workplace first. Therefore, it is an industrial issue. And of course, industrially is where we have our strength across all sectors. So the question then is, how do our reps and members prepare industrially for what might come from Brexit? Well, there's a couple of things. Again, in the coming hours and days, Unite will be launching a brand new legal helpline for European members who are concerned about their right to remain their settled status in the UK. They will be able to phone a number provided by the Unite Legal Department, and they'll be able to receive free legal advice on the settled status programme and what Brexit means as an unfolding event for our members who are European citizens. So that's fundamental importance. I should add as well that some employers have already committed to paying the £60 administrative fee for the settled status programme. That includes the NHS, and so I think it should be a campaigning demand for all of our employers who should be asked to pay that, and for dependents, in order to help secure their staff and workers and get them through the settled status programme. Some other employers in different sectors have also committed to that. In manufacturing, groups like Rolls-Royce and Airbus, for example, but the NHS is by far and away the biggest employer to have committed to that. So anybody in the NHS supply chain or the periphery, or indeed academia, should be raising that demand that employers support their staff through this. And then, of course, we've got a couple of other things. Well, there's Brexit contingency planning. Most private sector employers, and indeed so outsourced, if you like, public sector employers, do have some form of contingency planning in place. If they don't, they've been utterly negligent at this point. So the question is, how can we use our information and consultation agreements in order to get a seat at the table at those contingency meetings and make sure that Brexit isn't just passed down to our members? So there's some resources on Unite Brexit Check website for that, and that includes a draft Brexit agreement. Now, this is quite a broad thing which we're looking for reps to table with their employers, and it basically makes the brief outline that working people should not be forced to pay the price of Brexit at work. and it mentions all the EU directives which currently underpin working rights originally won by trade unions, and it says we are calling on employers to continue to honour those working rights and obligations and ideally transfer them into our collective bargaining agreements and arrangements. That is how we've changed this from a very abstract political issue into a concrete industrial issue and provide certainty for our members. That's also partly about exposing opportunism for employers. So part of our work in the research department has been surveying reps, talking to reps and members across all different sectors and looking for where employers are trying to use Brexit opportunistically to attack pay, attack terms and conditions, etc., etc. So even if you think you're in an employer who wouldn't sign that document, I think it's still worth tabling it because it will flush them out to an extent to say, are they prepared to honour in any way, shape or form all existing working rights, terms and conditions you have fought for to defend for your members? And if they aren't prepared to say that, then it raises a question mark as to why. And it's useful for us to know that as we get ahead to March, no matter how that unfolds, because it's highly likely that the industrial sphere of this will take priority when the political circus of this moves on. So that's a fundamental question.
And then another one, I think this probably you've already answered, but I didn't know if you wanted to add any more points to it. We've had a tweet from Wellbank D. Ask your members, so I'm guessing they're not a member, ask your members if they want a people's vote.
Fair enough. Well, that's the question that always comes up, of course. Naturally, Brexit is a political issue, it's a divisive issue. The key thing, as I have said, is that the union's policy is to keep all options on the table, which includes a people's vote. Our priority and our preference, if you like, as a union is to secure a general election, but no option is taken off the table. And if the EC feels that actually it isn't possible to secure a general election because of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, because of other areas, in which case, in order to prevent a no deal or in order to prevent a disastrous Tory Brexit, a people's vote becomes the go-to option, then that option remains open. So I'm not going to stand here and say that Unite is going to campaign for a people's vote and that is it. It's far more nuanced than that. It's far more important to keep us all united, to keep our focus on the deal in the next weeks ahead, make sure that deal is defeated, and then look at all the potential possibilities it opens up. And for our democratic structures to take command of that. That means take this debate to your workplace, take it to your branch, talk to members on this committee or at your industrial sector NISCs, for example. Talk to your EC members, make sure that they are accurately reflecting the opinions of your membership when they make these decisions. That's why our democratic structures exist. So it's not for me or for any one individual to determine what our policy is on this. It's for those democratic structures to decide, and all options remain on the table.
Brilliant, Ben. Well, thanks for that. We've not had any other questions in today, but as Ben said, if anything comes up, having watched the video, then do get in touch. You've obviously got our Twitter handle at @unite_MHNA, or you can send us a message on Facebook, or you can email, so it's dave.munday, MUNDAY, @unitetheunion.org. And obviously our members' views and opinions are absolutely central to the work that we do, so please do get in touch. I just want to also say this is the first session that we're doing, hopefully of a more regular kind of update, information giving sessions that we're going to do for Unite MHNA members. We're hopefully going to confirm the topic of the January session in the next few days, so do keep an eye again on Facebook and Twitter, and obviously if you've got any ideas for sessions that you want us to cover, then please get in touch. But thanks Ben for doing today.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching along.